Before Cherrelle ever became an R&B name, she was just Cheryl Anne Norton, born on October 13, 1958, in Los Angeles, California. She didn't come from a dynasty of stars. Her path was built through determination and a little twist of fate. Growing up between Los Angeles and Detroit, she was surrounded by two different worlds: the Hollywood music machine on the West Coast and the gritty Motown legacy in the Midwest. It gave her both polish and soul, a mix that would define her voice. And that stage name? Cherrelle wasn't some label-made branding. It came from her day job at a bank where her boss would jokingly yell, "Cherrelle, you're late." The nickname stuck and eventually became the identity she carried into stardom. Her early career began with background singing and touring. She linked up with Michael Henderson and later joined Luther Vandross on the road, sharpening her performance chops long before anyone outside of industry insiders knew her name. Everything shifted in 1983, when a demo tape of hers landed in the hands of Clarence Avant, the legendary founder of Taboo Records. Avant, known as the godfather of black music, heard something unique in her voice: playful, sultry, and street smart. He signed her on the spot, setting up her introduction to powerhouse producers Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. This was the launch pad. From a bank teller with a funny nickname to standing on the edge of an R&B breakthrough, Cherrelle was about to step into the spotlight, one that would bring both incredible highs and whispers of hidden drama. When Cherrelle hit Taboo Records in the mid-80s, she wasn't just another R&B hopeful. She had a secret weapon: Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. These were the same producers who would later shape Janet Jackson's empire. But in 1984, they were fine-tuning their sound and using Cherrelle as one of their early muses. Her debut album, Fragile, 1984, was proof of that chemistry. It didn't take long for her voice, a mix of sass, sweetness, and sharp delivery, to stand out. And then came the record that changed everything: I Didn't Mean to Turn You On. That song became her signature, hitting the R&B top 10 and even crossing into pop territory. It was edgy, it was flirty, and it was unapologetic. So bold, in fact, that Robert Palmer covered it in 1985, and later, Mariah Carey would take it to the next generation in 2001. But no matter how many versions came after, it was Cheryl's playful original that lit the fire. Her momentum didn't stop there. In 1985, she dropped her second album, High Priority, again teaming with Jam and Lewis. This one went gold and gave her the kind of duet that every artist dreams about. Saturday Love with Alexander O'Neal. It wasn't just a hit, it became a cultural timestamp. The chemistry between Cheryl and O'Neal was undeniable, both on stage and in the studio. The track climbed to number 2 on the R&B charts and cracked the UK top 10, making her a global name. By the late 80s, Cherrelle was no longer just a promising talent. She was an R&B mainstay. Every album felt like a step closer to solidifying her legacy, and her partnership with O'Neal turned into one of the most iconic duos of the decade. But fame in the 80s R&B world wasn't just about hit singles. It was about navigating label politics, rivalries, and rumors. And behind Cheryl's rise, the whispers had already begun. By the late 80s, Cherrelle wasn't just making hits, she was shaping the sound of R&B itself. And 1988 was the year she hit her absolute peak with the release of Affair. This wasn't just another album. Built like a concept piece, it followed the story of a relationship torn apart, mirroring the kind of emotional drama that her fans swore they saw in her own life. Produced once again by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, it gave Cherrelle her first and only #1 R&B single, Everything I Miss at Home. The song's haunting groove and confessional tone captured what made her unique. She wasn't just singing to you, she was letting you in on the pain. The title track, Affair, turned into another chart success, and suddenly, Cherrelle was living the life that every R&B singer in the late 80s wanted: gold records, sold-out shows, and a growing international reputation. But it wasn't just the solo success. Her chemistry with Alexander O'Neal was still setting the industry on fire. Together, they released Never Knew Love Like This in 1987, a duet that became another signature anthem of the decade. For many fans, Cherrelle and O'Neal became the Bonnie and Clyde of R&B duets, playful, passionate, and dripping with drama that blurred the line between performance and reality. At this point, Cherrelle was on top. She had carved out a lane for herself in an era dominated by Janet, Whitney, and Anita Baker, holding her own with a very different style. Street smart, intimate, and a little bit dangerous. But the music industry has a cruel way of turning peaks into plateaus. The pressure to reinvent herself, the strain of label politics, and the constant rumors swirling in the background were beginning to weigh heavy. And soon, the same industry that lifted her up would begin quietly shutting doors. By the early 90s, the music world was shifting. The glossy Jammin' Lewis sound that defined the mid-80s was giving way to new jack swing, hip-hop, soul, and the rise of powerhouse voices like Mary J. Blige. For Cherrelle, this meant one thing: adapt or fade. In 1991, she released The Woman I Am, her first album without Jammin' Lewis behind the boards. Instead, she teamed with producer Narada Michael Walden, known for his work with Whitney Houston. On paper, it looked like the perfect transition. In reality, the magic was gone. The album didn't resonate the way her earlier work had, and without Jammin' Lewis's signature touch, Cherrelle struggled to hold her lane in an increasingly competitive R&B market. Throughout the decade, her commercial presence dimmed. By the late 90s, when R&B was dominated by the likes of Brandy, Monica, and Destiny's Child, Cherrelle resurfaced with The Right Time, 1999. Released independently, the project was raw, street-leaning, and even featured rapper Keith Murray, a sign that she was trying to stay connected to the next generation. But without major label backing, it barely made a dent. Her official discography seemed to end there, but Cheryl's name never truly disappeared. Compilation albums like The Best of Cherrelle, 1995, Greatest Hits, 2005, and Icon, 2011, kept her catalog alive. Tracks like Saturday Love and Everything I Miss at Home continued to live on radio, soundtracks, and nostalgic R&B playlists. By the 2000s, her presence shifted almost entirely to the live circuit. Cherrelle became a staple of old-school R&B tours, sharing stages with Alexander O'Neal, Ready for the World, and other 80s peers. These shows reminded fans of her impact, even if the industry had quietly moved her to the sidelines. It was an evolution marked not by reinvention, but by survival. Cherrelle never stopped performing, but her later work made one thing clear: the same industry that once celebrated her didn't know how to handle her when the spotlight dimmed. And that's when the rumors began to grow louder. If Cherrelle's solo career gave her a name, her collaborations made her unforgettable. Her musical partnership with Alexander O'Neal remains one of the most iconic R&B pairings of the 1980s. Together, they created duets that blurred the line between performance and lived experience. Saturday Love wasn't just a song, it was an anthem. A weekend ritual for fans across the US and the UK. Never Knew Love Like This, 1987, solidified their chemistry, becoming another timeless duet still played at old-school R&B sets today. For many, Cherrelle and O'Neal weren't just collaborators, they were storytellers, acting out the push and pull of relationships in a way that felt real. Fans whispered about whether their chemistry extended off stage, feeding into the gossip that swirled around both artists. But her influence didn't end there. Cherrelle's family connection tied her even deeper into R&B history. She is the cousin of Pebbles, Perry Reed, the singer behind Mercedes Boy and the woman who later managed TLC. The two even recorded together, teaming up on the song Always. That collaboration wasn't just music, it was bloodline artistry, proving that talent ran deep in their family. Her voice also influenced generations of producers and singers who loved her mix of sass and vulnerability. You can hear echoes of her style in artists who came after, from Janet's playful phrasing to the duets that dominated the 90s R&B scene. Cherrelle carved out a blueprint. You could be sweet and tough, vulnerable and sharp, all in the same breath. And while the mainstream industry may have started to overlook her in the 90s, her collaborations and vocal fingerprint kept her relevant. To this day, she remains a staple in R&B nostalgia tours, proving that her influence outlived her chart dominance. But while fans celebrated the music, behind the scenes there were always whispers, stories about Cherrelle's private life, industry politics, and rumors that painted a very different picture than the one her music projected. Even though her last studio album dropped back in 1999, Cherrelle has never fully stepped away from the stage. Instead, she's found a new lane, the nostalgia circuit. In the 2000s and 2010, she became a staple on old-school R&B lineups, often paired with Alexander O'Neal, Ready for the World, and other 80s hitmakers. While the mainstream spotlight dimmed, the love from her core fan base never disappeared. Every performance of Saturday, Love or Everything I Miss at Home, reminded audiences why she once sat near the top of R&B's food chain. Fast forward to 2024, and Cherrelle is still on stage. She was spotted headlining events like the show at Johnny May's Lounge in Minneapolis, still commanding the mic with that same playful, sultry edge that first made her famous decades ago. For fans, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was living proof that her voice, her presence, and her connection to the audience never faded. Her legacy is carved in two parts: the music, songs like I Didn't Mean to Turn You On, Saturday Love, and Everything I Miss at Home are etched into R&B history, influencing not just her peers, but future stars who learned how to balance vulnerability with swagger. The influence. Her duets with O'Neal defined an era of male-female collaboration in R&B, paving the way for future pairings that tried to capture the same electricity. Today, Cherrelle isn't at the top of the charts, but she's remembered. She's still performing, still drawing crowds, and still respected as one of the few artists who carried the Jam and Lewis sound into the mainstream. But while her stage presence remains, so do the whispers. Fans and gossip blogs have long speculated about what really happened when the industry doors started closing on her. Was it simply the changing sound of R&B? Or were there rumors, politics, and personal choices that kept her from reaching the level of superstardom her talent deserved? For all the hits and all the chemistry with Alexander O'Neal, there's a side of Cherrelle's story that never made it to the press releases. Behind the spotlight, fans and gossip blogs have whispered about a very different Cherrelle. On forums like Lipstick Alley, people speculated that she was romantically tied to one of the biggest drug kingpins of the 1980s, suggesting her career was boosted or even sabotaged by who she associated with. Some rumors even claim she married into that world. But here's the truth: none of it has ever been confirmed. Still, in an industry where perception is everything, whispers alone can close doors. By the 90s, as the sound of R&B shifted and new artists took over, Cherrelle's absence from the spotlight only fueled the speculation. Was she blackballed? Did label politics and her personal connections play a role? Or was it simply timing, her sound being swallowed by the rise of hip-hop soul and younger, fresher faces? There were also the Alexander O'Neal rumors. Fans swore their onstage chemistry was more than performance, and tabloids tried to spin them as an off-and-on couple. In reality, both admitted their relationship was professional, but the gossip machine never let go. Ironically, the same duets that made her famous also tied her identity to O'Neal's drama, overshadowing her as a solo star. Even family connections stirred chatter. Being cousins with Pebbles, the woman later accused of exploiting TLC, linked Cherrelle to industry scandals by association. It wasn't her mess, but her name still floated in those conversations. At the end of the day, the reality is simpler and maybe sadder. Cherrelle was an artist who peaked at the right time, but not for long enough. She had the voice, the producers, the chemistry. But when the sound of R&B evolved, the industry moved on. The rumors may make her story juicier, but the reality is that her career decline was less scandal and more silence. And yet, her music remains. Songs like Saturday Love still spark nostalgia, proving that whatever the truth is behind the whispers, Cherrelle's voice outlived the rumors. Cherrelle's career may not have stretched across decades of platinum success, but in the 1980s, she carved out a space that still echoes today. With just a few albums and unforgettable duets, she left behind a catalog that defined an era of R&B romance, vulnerability, and street-smart soul. As of 2025, Cherrelle's estimated net worth sits around $3 million. Not superstar numbers, but proof that her legacy, touring, and catalog royalties still pay off. She isn't headlining arenas, but she's still performing, still respected, and still drawing nostalgic crowds who remember exactly where they were the first time they heard Saturday Love. The hot take? Cherrelle's story is one of talent caught in transition. She had the producers, the songs, and the partnerships. But she came up in an industry that chews up singers when the sound shifts. Add in the rumors, the gossip, and the politics, and it's easy to see why she never reached Whitney or Janet levels of stardom. But unlike so many others, she didn't burn out, and she didn't vanish completely. Instead, Cherrelle is remembered as the voice of a moment when R&B was intimate, playful, and raw. She may have been underrated in her time, but decades later, she's still here, still performing, and still reminding fans that not every legend needs a crown to be remembered, because sometimes survival is the legacy.